The night began like any other in Ouagadougou, heavy with the scent of dust, smoke, and gasoline. The streets were dimly lit, shadows of poverty etched into every crumbling wall. Yet within moments, the darkness would be ripped apart by a blaze. So merciless it seemed to come not from this earth, but from the pit of despair itself. A bus, packed with villagers, students, and women returning from the market, hurtled down the narrow road. It was old, a relic of broken promises, patched with metal sheets, its engine coughing as though choking on its final breaths. In its belly, sparks caught, wires hissed, and then, without warning, an explosion tore through its frame. Flames swallowed the bus whole. The fire was alive. It screamed louder than the passengers inside, a furnace of terror. Windows shattered, black smoke rolled upward like a funeral banner, and the night erupted in chaos. Men ran forward only to recoil in fear. Mothers clawed the air, their children's cries muffled by fire. In the chaos, one sound rose above the inferno. The desperate cries of a blind woman trapped inside, clutching her stick, calling out into the void. Her voice was raw, breaking against the crackle of fire. "Help me! Please! Someone help!" The people froze. No one dared approach the inferno. The fire was a wall of death. And yet, in that moment, the crowd turned and saw him, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, his uniform smeared with dust, his eyes burning with something deeper than the flames before him. The fire roared like an enemy, daring him to step forward. The people whispered his name. And then, without hesitation, he moved. What Traoré did inside that fire would scar his soul forever and inspire a continent. The fire did not come out of nowhere. It was born long before the night that Bassi exploded, born of hunger, betrayal, and the slow suffocation of a nation. For months, Burkina Faso had been on its knees. The International Monetary Fund had tightened its grip, demanding more gold, more sacrifice, more submission. Each meeting ended the same way, men in expensive suits from across the sea telling Traoré that his people's suffering was necessary for stability. Stability for whom? Not the children whose stomachs bloated with hunger, not the farmers, watching their fields wither under sun and debt. The shadow of Thomas Sankara loomed over every speech Traoré gave, every step he took. The people remembered a time when hope was not a myth, when dignity was not a luxury. Sankara had promised an Africa that stood tall, and for that he had been betrayed, silenced. Traoré felt the weight of that unfinished dream pressing on his shoulders. He was not just fighting for Burkina Faso, he was fighting for Sankara's ghost. But while he fought, enemies gathered. 3 generals, men he once trusted, whispered in smoke-filled rooms. They saw him as too young, too reckless, too dangerous to the old order. His defiance of the IMF, his speeches of unity, his refusal to bow, all of it made him a target. And so they plotted, if the IMF couldn't break him with sanctions, they would break him with chaos. Meanwhile, the people suffered. Breadlines stretched like rivers of despair. Mothers buried children not because of war, but because they simply had nothing left to eat. Soldiers went unpaid, rifles turned cold in their hands. In the marketplaces, whispers spread. Maybe Traoré is just another leader who will fall like the rest. But in the silence of the night, Traoré himself felt it. The exhaustion, the endless weight of a nation gasping for air. In his rare moments alone, he would stare at the cracked ceiling above him, wondering if he was already a man marked for failure. Or worse, a man marked for death. And then the fire came. The burning. Bus was no mere accident. Rumors swirled almost instantly that the blaze had been lit by hands unseen, that it was not simply a mechanical failure, but a message, a warning to Traoré, a test of his will. If he froze, if he faltered, the people would see weakness. If he acted, they would see something else, a leader forged, not in speeches, but in flames. As the fire devoured the bus, mothers clawed at the ground, fathers wept openly, and children screamed into the night. And above it all, Traoré's voice rang out, a command not to his soldiers, not to his generals, but to himself, to step forward. The fire that consumed the bus was not just a blaze of wood and fuel. It was the fire of a nation's suffering, the fire of betrayal, the fire of history, and it waited to see whether Ibrahim Traoré would burn or rise. The city did not sleep after the bus fire. Smoke lingered in the air for days, its stench clinging to walls, clothes, and skin. People whispered about what they had seen, the captain who stepped into the blaze, the blind woman whose cries still echoed in their ears. Some swore they saw his silhouette standing against the flames like a soldier facing an army. Others believed it was no accident, that the fire was a message written in smoke and ash, and while the people murmured, the forces that fed the fire moved silently in the shadows. Behind polished wooden doors, in air-conditioned halls far from Ouagadougou, men in tailored suits reviewed their reports. They did not see the charred remains of the bus, nor hear the cries of its passengers. To them, Burkina Faso was a line in a ledger, a resource to be squeezed, a pawn in a game of global balance. They spoke in cold numbers, in percentages of gold, in the language of profit. But their decisions bled villages dry. Every sanction tightened the rope around the nation's neck. And yet, Ibrahim Traoré refused to bow. That refusal became his crime. In the barracks, soldiers sat restless, uniforms worn thin, boots split at the seams. They spoke in low voices of their children who went to bed hungry, of wives who searched for food in empty markets. Their loyalty wavered, not out of hatred for their captain, but from despair. A hungry soldier is a dangerous man, and the generals knew it. The three men who once stood at Traoré's side had grown impatient. To them, his vision was reckless idealism. His war against the IMF, against foreign control, against the very structure that fed them power. It endangered everything they had built for themselves. One general, his voice bitter with envy, spat words that carried through the smoke-filled room. He wants to be Sankara reborn. And we all know how that ended. The second nodded, his face hidden in the shadows. The boy is fire, and fire must be contained. The third leaned forward, his lips curling into a smile that bore no warmth. No, fire must be extinguished. They began their work not with bullets, but with whispers. They spread doubt in the ranks, poison in the minds of the people. They told merchants that Traoré would bankrupt them. They told mothers that more children would starve under his watch. They told soldiers that following him was a path to ruin, and as their words spread, the IMF applied its own pressure. Loans were frozen, aid was withheld. Supplies that once trickled in slowed to a halt. Hunger gnawed harder, desperation deepened. Burkina Faso was being strangled inch by inch. Traoré saw it in the eyes of his people. He walked through the markets where mothers clutched empty baskets, where fathers stared at food they could not afford, where children played not with toys, but with stones and sticks. He heard their words. "We cannot eat speeches." He felt their disappointment like knives against his skin. But worse than the hunger was the silence that fell when he spoke of hope. The people wanted to believe him, but belief does not fill bellies. Faith does not bury the dead. And every time another child was lowered into the earth, it was not the IMF that mothers cursed. It was him. In the quiet of his quarters, Traoré sat alone. His uniform lay on a chair, dust and sweat staining its fabric. He stared at the small photograph on his desk. Sankara, smiling, full of a promise that had been cut short. "Is this all I will be?" Traoré whispered to himself. Another dreamer who dies before the dream? He closed his eyes and felt the weight of the fire once more, the heat on his skin, the screams in his ears. That night had scarred him, but it had also carved something into his soul, a truth. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a test, and tests, he knew, were only beginning. Because somewhere in the city, in a villa surrounded by guards, the three generals were preparing the final act of their betrayal. And the IMF, oceans away, waited for his collapse with the patience of vultures circling above a dying animal. Traoré could not yet see the shape of the storm, but he felt it, pressing closer with every passing day. The fire that had tested his soul was only the spark. What came next would consume everything. The first shot was not fired on a battlefield, but in the silence of betrayal. A convoy of supply trucks bound for the northern villages, carrying rice, medicine, and sacks of grain, was intercepted in the dead of night. Soldiers who were meant to protect the people instead turned their rifles inward. The food disappeared, the medicine burned. By dawn, the villages received nothing but rumors. Children woke with hunger clawing at their bellies. Mothers withered under the weight of despair. And in the barracks, whispers spread that it was Traoré himself who had failed to deliver. The general's plan was working. Sanctions from abroad tightened. The markets grew emptier. Even water seemed to turn against the people, the wells drying under an unforgiving sun. The IMF's grip was invisible, but its presence was felt in every stomach that groaned, in every pair of eyes dulled by starvation. For the common people, it no longer mattered who pulled the strings, only that they were suffering. In the capital, a mother held her child in her arms, rocking the little boy who no longer had the strength to cry. Her husband had left days before, searching for work, for food, for anything. He never returned. She heard rumors of rebel checkpoints, of men dragged from their carts, of fathers beaten for daring to resist. When her child's breathing slowed, she whispered prayers that rose into the night sky. The prayers joined thousands of others, floating above a city suffocating under its own silence. And in that silence, soldiers began to falter. They gathered in small groups, their faces hardened by hunger and doubt. They spoke of the captain who had promised a new dawn, but now seemed powerless against the darkness. "He speaks of Africa rising," one said bitterly. "But can he even keep Burkina Faso from falling?" Others sat quietly, torn between loyalty and despair, until one by one they began to believe the whispers planted by the generals, that Traoré was not a savior, but a curse. In the shadows of this crumbling faith, the generals made their move. They promised stability, food, and a return to order. They offered gold to wavering commanders, whispered threats to those who resisted, and planted fear in the ranks. One night, in a dimly lit room thick with cigarette smoke, the three of them sealed their pact. "We strike not with honor, but with certainty," the first muttered, pouring himself a drink. "We'll give the people their scapegoat," the second added, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. The third leaned forward, his voice cold and deliberate. "By the time the captain realizes, it will already be too late." And so it began. Saboteurs lit fires in marketplaces and left pamphlets, blaming the government. Explosions echoed near supply depots. Soldiers once loyal to Traoré began to vanish, their loyalty bought with promises of wealth. The city of Ouagadougou, once alive with chants of unity, now trembled under the weight of suspicion. Neighbors no longer trusted neighbors. Friends no longer spoke in the open. Everyone feared the invisible hand guiding the chaos. Traoré stood in the center of it all, carrying the weight of betrayal like armor. He walked among the people, listening to their pain, seeing the bones pressing against their skin. He returned to the barracks, where his soldiers' salutes grew weaker each day. And at night, in the dim light of his study, he wrote words that no one would ever read, confessions of a man torn between hope and despair. But there was no time left for doubt. Reports came of rebels advancing from the north, armed and supplied by unseen benefactors. Border posts fell one by one. Farmers abandoned their fields, Families fled into the forests. The war that had been whispered into existence was now roaring to life, and within the city, a date was set. The generals prepared their decisive blow, the confrontation that would either break Traoré's spirit or end his life entirely. The hour of reckoning was no longer a distant storm. It was at the gates. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant growl of thunder rolling across the horizon. Inside the capital, the air trembled with something greater than weather, the weight of history pressing down on a single man's shoulders. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the war room, the maps before him smeared with red ink, marking towns already lost, villages burned, and roads strangled by rebel checkpoints. Every path seemed blocked, every option poisoned by betrayal. The generals were no longer shadows whispering in smoke-filled rooms. They were wolves circling closer, their teeth bared. Their propaganda had spread like wildfire, claiming Traoré had sold his people's future to foreign powers, that he was nothing more than a puppet draped in military green. And now, the trap was closing. At dawn, a convoy of armored trucks rolled toward the presidential compound, engines rumbling like drums of war. Inside, men loyal to the generals prepared themselves to deliver the final strike. Their orders were clear: capture or kill, no negotiations, no hesitation. But Traoré was waiting. He had stripped his office bare, leaving behind medals, portraits, and every symbol of authority. In their place he wore only his uniform, worn, stained, and frayed from years of service. On his head, the red beret glowed like a beacon in the dim light. He knew what was coming, and he would not face it as a politician or a ruler. He would face it as a soldier. When the first shots cracked through the morning air, the compound walls shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling. Soldiers loyal to Traoré scrambled into position, their rifles trembling in their hands. The firefight erupted instantly, bullets tearing through stone, sparks bursting from metal. Smoke curled through the corridors, turning the compound into a labyrinth of fire and chaos. And in the heart of it, Traoré moved like a force of nature. He led from the front, not hiding behind shields or walls, but pushing forward through the storm. His voice rose above the thunder of gunfire, rallying men who had nearly lost their courage. "Hold the line," he roared. "This is our land, and no one will take it from us." Every corner turned was a battlefield. Every staircase climbed another trial. The general's forces pressed harder, outnumbering and outgunning those who still clung to loyalty. But each time defeat seemed inevitable, Traoré appeared, a flash of red, a defiant shout, a strike against the tide. His presence became more than flesh and blood. It became the heartbeat of resistance itself. Outside the compound, the city listened. The people who had been silenced by fear, who had starved and mourned in silence, now heard the crack of rifles echoing like a drumbeat. They whispered his name, then they shouted it, and soon their voices carried through the streets. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. The generals had planned for betrayal, for silence, for submission, but they had not planned for hope. By midday, the battle reached its peak. The rebels breached the outer defenses, flooding the compound with fire and fury. For 93 harrowing minutes, it seemed as though the walls themselves might collapse. But in that chaos, Traoré made his stand. He seized control of the courtyard, rallying the last of his soldiers into a circle of steel. They fought not for pay, not for orders, but for survival, for the idea that their captain's dream was worth bleeding for. One general fell, struck down in the chaos. Another fled, disappearing into the smoke. The third remained, cornered at last. Traoré stood before him, battered and bleeding, his uniform torn, his beret darkened with ash. The man who had plotted in shadows now trembled in the light of Traoré's defiance. The courtyard fell silent as Traoré raised his fist. "This is not for me," he declared, his voice raw but unbroken. "This is for Africa, for every mother, every child, every soldier who still believes we can rise. And with that, the tide turned. The generals' forces faltered. Their courage withered. What had begun as betrayal ended in collapse, their empire of lies crumbling before the weight of a people who refused to kneel. The compound still burned. The air still stank of smoke and blood, but in that moment, in that defiance, something far greater was born. The fire that was meant to consume him had instead revealed the steel of his soul. The compound still smoldered, its blackened walls whispering of the battle that had raged only hours before. Smoke hung over the capital like a funeral shroud, yet within that darkness, a strange stillness took hold. It was the silence that comes after a storm. Fragile, uncertain, but heavy with possibility. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the courtyard where the betrayal had ended. Around him, wounded soldiers leaned against broken walls, their faces smeared with ash and blood, their eyes locked on him as if he alone was keeping the earth from collapsing beneath them. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning stone, yet in the distance, faint voices began to rise. Not cries of fear, but chants, low, steady, growing with every second. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. It spread like fire through the streets. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands filled the avenues. The people who had been beaten into silence by hunger and despair were now roaring with a voice that no bullet could silence. Mothers carried children on their backs. Old men leaned on sticks, youths banged on metal drums, all crying the same name. The sound swelled, rolling over the city like thunder. Across the continent, the news traveled faster than gunfire. Images of the battle leaked through radios, phones, and whispers carried by traders crossing borders. In Mali, young men raised fists to the sky. In Niger, women marched barefoot through markets, chanting in unison. In Ghana, students draped flags across their shoulders. And in every corner of Africa, the same question echoed. If Traoré can stand, why can't we? The IMF boardrooms fell into chaos. Men in suits who had spoken with arrogance now stuttered in disbelief. Their threats, sanctions, and ultimatums, tools they had wielded for decades, suddenly seemed like paper swords. They had not planned for this. They had not planned for Africa to see itself reflected in the fire of one man's defiance. Burkina Faso's surviving generals, those who had hidden in the shadows of foreign influence, now found themselves exposed. Their promises of wealth, their whispers of power, had collapsed into dust. They had gambled on fear, and they had lost to hope. Traoré, though scarred and exhausted, refused to step back. He walked into the streets, surrounded not by armored trucks or bodyguards, but by his people. Hands reached out to touch him, rough hands of farmers, trembling hands of widows, tiny hands of children. Each one clung to him not as a leader, but as proof that they had not been abandoned. He raised his voice above the roaring crowd. It was not polished, not rehearsed, but raw and heavy with truth. We are not slaves to hunger. We are not shadows to be erased. We are Africa, and we will rise. The city erupted. Tears streamed down faces worn by years of suffering, yet those tears mingled with smiles brighter than the fire still burning in the distance. For the first time in a generation, the people were not looking down in despair. They were looking up to the horizon, and the world trembled, because in that moment, it was no longer just Burkina Faso. The fire that had tested Traoré's soul had ignited something far greater, a continent's awakening. The IMF would regroup. Foreign powers would scheme again. Battles still loomed ahead. But something irreversible had been born in the smoke of that courtyard. The chains that had held Africa down for centuries had begun to crack. And as the chants thundered through the night, one question lingered in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. Was this the day Africa finally rose to break its chains?